Welcome to our study on the book of Ephesians. This is session 55. I want to say a word right here at the outset to anyone because you know we're in Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 3. And this is about children. Verse 4 is going to be about parents. And I want to say something right here at the beginning to anyone who's listening to this and you think there's not going to be much here for you, either because maybe you're not married or because you don't have children, or because you have children, but they're all grown. Well, first of all, anybody who has made the cry of Abba Father should always be interested in learning the doctrine. And even though these verses may not apply directly to you, I just want to say that perhaps you know some people who are married and have children. And if the time ever came that they needed some help or assistance or of wise counsel in some way, then you would know the doctrine and you would be able to help someone if they encountered some trouble. And so I'm just trying to say that for all of us, I think this is going to be profitable in one way or another. All right, let's get right into it now. Ephesians chapter 6, and let's read verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, we covered the first part of this verse last week. Now we come to this part where he says, for this is right. And when Paul says for that children are to obey their parents, for this is right, what is he talking about there? I actually think he's talking about it is the right thing to do. Now, what does that mean? I mean that for children to obey parents is the right thing to do for every family, not just for Christian families. In other words, it isn't just the godly thing to do, it is the right thing for everyone to do. Now, I erased the board this morning, but I had it from last week. You remember that the family is a divine institution, and we are preserving that divine institution when children obey their parents. So when Paul says for children to obey their parents, for this is right, he's saying to obey parents is the right thing in and of itself. That whether you're saved or lost, that is the right thing to do. Now, God has ordained that all children obey their parents, whether the parents are saved or not, because every family unit can be preserved by the obedience of the children. But for Christian families, now there's a little bit of a difference. For Christian families, Paul wants them to understand that when children obey their parents, they're not just preserving their own family unit, and they are, but for Christians, they are laboring with God in what He is doing in that institution of family. And so, but when he says, for this is right, I think he's talking about this is the right thing for this to happen in every family just this way. Now, children are under the protection and authority of their parents. And it is part of the order of nature that children submit to the authority of their parents, okay? And parental authority is a kind of a basic rule of life. That's true even in the animal world. You can watch little young animals, being mothered and following their mother and emulating their mother and all that kind of business. But especially in the human world, the human family is meant to be a picture of God's family. All right. So by instructing children to obey their parents in the godly labor section of Ephesians, remember we kind of broke that down last week? This is the godly labor section. Paul is saying that young people can have a tremendous effect on the unity of the family. So if you're a teenager, let me encourage you. Labor with your Heavenly Father by obeying your parents and start looking at that obedience from that standpoint. So by being obedient, you are preserving the family unit. You're preserving a divine institution, which happens to be the very foundation for the community and the society in which you live, and ultimately, of course, for the nation itself. Satan, of course, has a different plan. He is the author of rebellion, And so he wants to put thoughts into people's minds so that they actually rebel against the God-given authority. Just understand when those thoughts come into your head, identify where those are probably coming from, and understand what your Heavenly Father wants. He wants you to labor with Him in this divine institution. Now let's move to verse 2. Because obeying your parents, that's for those kids that are still living at home, not considered to be independent adults. Okay, but now we come to verse 2 and we get another instruction. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. So in verse 1, we have the command to obey your parents. In verse 2, we have the instruction to honor our father and mother. And I believe that one holds true no matter how old we get. We can get married, we can move out, we can have our own family. I think we're still supposed to honor our parents. And we should do this not just because we love our father and mother. Now, if you do love them, I mean, that's a wonderful thing, and it ought to be that way. But look, you have to understand that we do this because this is part of our godly labor as children, even after we've moved out of the home. So the fact that this is an opportunity to labor with your father ought to really mean something to you. And the reason that saved children obey, the reason that teenagers obey, is not because they like the rules, but it's because they love God and they desire to do His will. Look, let me just step aside just for a moment and say, all of the things that you're doing in your life really need to have something bigger behind them than just us. And so here's a way, okay, I obey my parents, I'm living at home, I guess I got to do what they say. But actually, you can do real good here by laboring with your father in this thing. The same thing is true with adult children when they continue to honor their father and mother. And that's kind of the thing that I want to talk about. But before I do, I want to finish up this thing about kids living at home still under the authority of their parents. And this is going to be on your note taker from last week. So if you have that in front of you, we didn't do that figure 4 note taker. So we're going to fill that in today. And so that one is going to, so I'm going to say it this way. When a teenager, and I'm saying teenagers because this is really when they begin to have more independent thought on their own and have trouble, living by the rules or being obedient. When as a teenager, you understand that rebellion against your parents, and this is the first one here, that rebellion against your parents actually damages God's divine institution of family. And I want you to have that in your mind. Now, on your note taker, I took that disobedience and rebellion and I just compacted that to the DR. I think everybody can see that. Secondly, when a teenager understands that by disobedience, he is going down a path that Satan has charted. And I want you to think about that one for a moment. Because when you're having a hard time with the rules, and you're thinking, I don't want to do that, I don't want to obey that, just understand that where that comes from is Satan is trying to get you down a different path than God is trying to get you down. Number 3, when a teenager understands that how he responds to his parents' authority in his family is going to impact his future family. Now, for abbreviation, I just said it on the note taker, that disobedience and rebellion impacts future families. But it's not just future families, it's his future family. Now let me give you an illustration of this so everybody can understand what we're talking about. Here's a teenager living at home, and he kind of gets into this rebellious mode, and he just doesn't want to do the things that he's supposed to do, and he's not just going to be corrected by it. If you think, now you're going to cause trouble in your own family unit with your parents, and that's going to cause real chaos, a lack of intimacy. Everybody's going to suffer through that. That's not going to be fun for you, not going to be fun for your parents or for anybody else living in the house. But one day, you're going to have your own family. And here's what you need to understand. What you learned by how you responded to authority back when you were the one under authority, you're going to carry all of that disobedient and rebellious baggage into your family. We have this idea that we can live our life in a certain way and conduct ourselves contrary to the doctrine, and then when we need to, we can just turn on the right thing to do. But you can't. All of those things, they're producing, all that disobedience and rebellion is producing something in you. And you're going to take that into your own family in the future, and that is going to make it hard for you to be the right kind of authority figure in your home. Here's the second thing. Your kids will pick up on that, and they'll continue to do the very thing that you did. And so what I'm saying is when a teenager stops to realize, hey, you know, my disobedience and my rebellion is actually damaging God's divine institution of family. Why is that important? Because family is the very foundation for the society in which we live. If you do away with family, you do away with society at large. You do. You do away with a great piece of civilization. And nations won't be able to function. I promise you, we have no idea what it is like to live in a world where family is not at the very heart of everything, that everything else gets built on that. And it would be terribly, terribly bad. So when a teenager stops to realize, look, even though it's not measurable, there's nowhere I can go and see a meter where the needle now is doing this, and I realize the effect I'm having. From the things we're learning from God's Word, it's important to realize that by my disobedience and rebellion, I am damaging God's institution. But by obeying like I'm supposed to, I am now actually laboring with my Father to preserve not just my family, but that institution at large in society. Number two, when a teenager realizes that my disobedience and rebellion, that's a path that Satan has charted for me. And all these things will come into your mind about this is why you need to not obey. This is why you need to give everybody a hard time. This is why you need to be rebellious. Understand where that comes from. And if that's as bothersome to you as it is to me, you would have second thoughts about that. You'd identify who the real culprit is. And the one we just did, disobedience and rebellion, impacts our future families, because how you respond in your family is the skill you're going to take with you into your own family in the future. And it's too late to learn about it at that point. You'll already be making those mistakes. Here's the next one. When a teenager understands just how much his obedience affects, and I'm going to go to the big one, the nation. Yeah, it affects your home, it affects your community, it affects the society, and all of that together, all of these different families and all these different communities, that's what makes up a nation. And if these families are dysfunctional, you get a dysfunctional nation. And so I just want us to understand that has an effect all the way up to the nation. And number 5, when a teenager understands how necessary the family unit is to what God desires to do. When they understand that the family unit is necessary to God's will being accomplished in the world, then that should drive them to labor with God by being obedient to his parents. Now look, I grew up in a time when the things that were going on when I grew up, that was the hippie generation. And that was when everybody grew their hair out. Hard for me to do that today. But everybody grew their hair out, and they kind of rebelled against their parents and, did their own thing. That was the culture, that was at work when I was growing up. But I'm going to tell you something. Not because I'm just so good, but look, I never really got into that culture. First of all, I had a great relationship with my parents. Wonderful relationship with my dad. I never looked at him like he was out of touch. I never looked at him like, you know what, I'm glad I'm not you. I actually wanted to be like him. My dad was kind of my hero. I mean, everything about him, I just really appreciated. In fact, I would tell my dad things I would never tell my friends because my friends might think I'm not cool. But my dad loved me unconditionally, and I knew that. And so I could tell him about the things that I was really worried about when I was a little bit reluctant to do that with the others. And as a result, I was basically a pretty good kid. I didn't get in trouble. So my parents could actually trust me on, Friday night, you're going to go hang out with all your buddies and, go places and do things. They could always trust that I wasn't going to get into trouble, that they weren't going to, have to worry about me getting into things I shouldn't have gotten into. And as a result, in the beginning years of those teenage years when I was old enough to, start doing that kind of stuff, they'd give me a time to be home. I was always on time. It's just the way it was. And then eventually, they just didn't have a time because they knew I'd be responsible and I'd come in and do that. Now, what I wish I had known but didn't know, because look, were there some things I didn't want to do? Oh, absolutely, sure. But that was the rules, and I just went by the rules. I loved my parents, had a great relationship. I didn't want to be an embarrassment to them. I wanted to stay out of trouble, and so I just did what I did. But here's the thing. I wish I had known I was actually laboring with my Father. Now, I'm saying that because someone may say, well, weren't you? If you were obeying, weren't you laboring with your Father? No. Now, I hope I can say this in a way where everybody kind of understands it. To labor with God, you have to actually understand that's what you're doing. You can't do it accidentally. Not labor with God. What can you do? Well, let me give you an example. Look, we can use this illustration right here. Here's a lost family. Are there any lost families where the kids obey their parents? Sure there are. No, not always. But are there some? Sure. That family is not laboring with God in the divine institution. They don't even know about that. What are they doing, though? Are they preserving the unity of their own family? They are. They are. Are they, do they have a good family model for the rest of the community to observe? They do. But those things, while they are important, they are not laboring with your Father. To labor with your Father, I believe, now someone will probably disagree with this, that's okay. I've really thought about this. I don't think you can labor with God out of the doctrine unless you know the doctrine and you're choosing to labor with your Heavenly Father in this. And that makes a little bit of a difference. You understand what I'm saying? So you have to know that's what you're doing. Because if lost people can do it, lost people can't be godly. Can they do the right thing? Yes. Remember how that started? Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. That's why I said that applies to everybody, lost or saved. Yeah, you can do the right thing, but you can't really labor with God until you understand intelligently, this is how I labor with my Heavenly Father, and now that's my motive. So if a teenager says, yeah, I obey my parents because I actually like all of the rules. Okay. But what about if there's a rule now that you don't like? You say, well, maybe I would do that because I have a good relationship with my parents. Okay, I'm glad you do. But what about that kid that doesn't have a good relationship with his parents? What about him? If he has a relationship with God, now there is something in him. And that's why I say, yeah, I obeyed the rules. I stayed out of trouble. I kept my nose clean. I did what I was supposed to do. But I didn't realize this was an opportunity for me to labor with God in a divine institution, and that was actually, I'm using this last point here, that was necessary in order for God to accomplish His will in the world. In fact, if you had said that to me back then, I would have went, well, how does that work? I would not have had enough knowledge of that to be able to comprehend it. But I wish I had. And so I'm just saying that these are the spiritual reasons. These would be the reasons that a son or daughter would have in their mind to be able to obey the instruction that Paul is giving here in these first 3 verses in Ephesians chapter 6. Okay, so there's those 5 things that I wanted to give us and to fill in last week's note taker. So it's the job of parents now to instill within their children a knowledge of the divine institutions. What am I saying? I'm saying when kids are little, they need to understand. Can I just put these up on the board, because I think this is really good. I think this is really important. So I think kids need to know from their parents early on that they are made in the image of God. And then they need to understand what that is. Now, I did a session on this, or maybe a couple of sessions. It's been a year, maybe 2 years ago, I don't know. But that was such a big thing to me as I was studying that, to understand what does it mean to be made in the image of God, and what is the advantage of that, and why is that necessary? God's not just doing that for no reason. What's going on with that? And I was kind of so overwhelmed, that's not, but it seemed to be so significant that we're made in the image of God. I went home and I created a little children's book to explain to kids what it means to be made in the image of God. Now, I still have it. I haven't ever done anything more with it. I just kind of had all that working in my mind, and I thought, that's important because that... All right, can I just take a minute here and do a little bit of a side issue? So let's do this. Let's make this your worldview. And you know what makes up your worldview? All the beliefs, all the things that you believe. Okay, I'm just gonna. And then you have things that, I mean, in your life, there's 1,000 things that you believe. The things that are out here on the periphery, and I should have wrote these smaller if I was doing this right. The things that are out here on the periphery, they're the things that you believe they're true, but if you changed your mind about those, they wouldn't affect very much of your life at all. And that's why those are out there on the edges. That might be something that you believe, and then all of a sudden you don't believe that anymore, or you believe something else. It doesn't change very much about you. But the closer those beliefs move now toward the center of your worldview, now that belief, those beliefs that are at the center and make up that part, they are the core of who you are. In other words, those are the beliefs that now make up who you are, what you think about yourself, how you view life. That's your worldview. The fact that if you get taught early on that you are made in the image of God, that ought to be something now that is at the very core of who you are. In a couple of years, I want to do, when we do that yearly get together in June, I actually want to take this idea and I want to talk about how to develop our love for God so that we love God with all our mind. Remember that thing, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. And we have all those kinds of words. And I want to talk about how in the world do we take the love that we have for God. I mean, that would be a belief. That would be something that we believe. And how do you take something that you believe and make it stronger? Now, I don't want to get too far off in the weeds here. I'm just trying to think about how little I can say about this. There is a way to cultivate a belief. Is there something that in your mind, I'm trying to think of a way to illustrate this, you believe it's true, but you're not 100% positive that it's true, but you're pretty sure it's true? Or there's something else that maybe you're not really sure one way or the other. Is there a way to take one of your beliefs and grow that belief? And you can't, there is, but it's not just by an act of your will. So let's I got Clifford and Rachel sitting in front of me, so, they become the natural target for my illustration. So let's suppose that I say to Clifford, I'll give you $1,000 if you will believe that you are sitting right next to a 6-foot pink rabbit. He can't collect that. Do you know why? Because he can't believe that. But okay, Richard said, but he's right there. I see him. All right. Why? Because, see, there's no incentive that can make you believe something. You either believe it or you don't. But here's the thing. There is a way to take a belief that may not be very strong and turn it into a stronger belief. Just like there is a way to take a belief that is sitting out here. Let's just write this little to kind of illustrate that here's a little belief, and that's the fact that you're born in the image, that you are made in the image of God. Is there a way to make that thing stronger? Yes. And the stronger that belief gets, and the more you know about it, not only can it become stronger, but you can move that belief now to the very core of who you are. Okay, that's enough. We can talk about that later. But I think every kid needs to learn early on that they're made in the image of God, and what does that mean, and what does that do for them, and why in the world did God do that? Here's the next thing I think they need to know. I think they need to know about the divine institutions. Why? Because these are the things that God did that are absolutely necessary. These are not optional. And so, give me an idea about the divine institutions. We've been talking about two of them this week. We've been talking about marriage, and we've been talking about family. And those are certainly divine institutions. And so, they need to know about those divine institutions. And if they know about them early on, that God is the creator of this, not some smart guy, but God is the creator of this. And why? Why is he doing that? Because these form the very bedrock of society. I promise you, when the day comes that we no longer are really looking at those two things, this whole civilization will crumble apart. And people will be looking around at the chaos that is everywhere, and they'll be saying, how did we get here? And I spent time last week talking about the necessity of these two divine institutions. God had to do these in the very beginning so that mankind didn't destroy itself on the planet. All right, so I think we need to instill in them how necessary, not just what those institutions are, but why they are important. Kids have that in their mind right off the bat. It is also the job of the parents to talk about Satan's tactics, because there is an adversary, and he doesn't care that your kids are little. He will implant the wrong kind of ideas in them so that he gets them going down his track instead of God's track. And so you have to warn them about the ways that Satan tends to corrupt. And how will he do that? By fostering rebellion, by disobedience, by delayed obedience or partial obedience. Those are all ways that, and if kids learn about that, then it's kind of like forewarning them so they can forearm themselves. I also think that parents ought to inform children about the things that we do now have an impact on us down the road. So here's what I'm going to call this. I'm going to call that the law of sowing and reaping. You can't grow up sowing rebellion and disobedience and disrespect and all of that, and then suddenly you become an adult with integrity and all of these great things built into you. Where we are is a product of how we have got there. And you can't go in the wrong direction and wind up in the right place. So that's another thing kids need to learn. And that is true in every dispensation. I know someone looks at that and says, well, that's out of the parables over there. No, that's a principle that is true in every dispensation. Parents should also demonstrate to their kids that personal righteousness has an effect even on the nation. And unrighteousness also has an effect on the nation. It is hard to perceive why. And I don't know how to categorize that one. I looked at my notes, but I didn't give myself a shorthand version for that. But if you're talking about the effect that we have, so I guess what we'll do is we'll call that consequences. And those consequences aren't just immediate and they're not just personal, but they contribute to the overall consequences now that have an effect even on the nation. And here's the last one. Kids need to be schooled about God's will. You know, and just to put it out here, let's do it like this. Actions have consequences. So anybody reading that will understand what I'm talking about. Kids need to understand that God has a will about things and is trying to accomplish this will and how important that is. If you instill these kinds of things at an early age, then guess what? The very kinds of things that we're talking about now, children, obey your parents in the Lord, it dovetails right into that perfectly. All of these set the stage for a family unit that is able not only to function happily on its own, but it contributes now to the community of which it's a part and ultimately, I think, impacts the nation. Okay, now I wanted to say that to kind of finish up on that thing about children that are still in the home. Now let's come back to verse 2 and look at this. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth. While obedience is a requirement for children which are not yet independent adults, honoring our father and mother, I said this a while ago, we will never outgrow that. That is supposed to be true for us no matter how old we are and no matter if our parents are saved or lost. Honor your father and mother. You realize that is one of the commandments. Which one is it? It's the fifth commandment. The first four have to do with your relationship with God. Then in 5, it starts talking about now your relationship with others. And so that's not a new thing when Paul writes this in Ephesians 6. In fact, he makes reference to the fact that it is a commandment. So God has some other commands too, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness, right? Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. All of those things are understood by the world to be wrong actions. And they understood that even before the law of Moses was given. You understand? These are things that are kind of built in to the conscience of people where they understand that. But what I'm getting at is that God could have said, thou shalt not kill because killing is wrong. But that's not the reason that he says it. Or thou shalt not steal because stealing is wrong. The world already understood those things to be wrong. He didn't need to say it that way. But when he says, children, obey your parents, he says what? For this is right. Now he is telling us what it is. So what does it mean to honor our parents? Well, in a nutshell, it means that we show them great respect and reverence and esteem them. And how is that done? It means that in the way that we think about them, we're thinking about them respectfully and graciously. And in the things that we do, of course. That means the way we talk to them and the way we treat them. If someone is highly regarded, if they're highly esteemed or highly thought of, then you know what? We speak to them in a way that conveys how they are to us. And then we behave in that way too, always in a very respectful manner. I used to have a couple of rules with the kids when they were growing up. One of those is you can disagree with each other and have a difference of opinion, but you can't express it physically. So, if you want to have a disagreement about ideas, that's fine, but you don't get to put each other in a headlock over the issue. Now you've crossed the line. And here was the other one. You can come and tell me anything that you need to say if you feel like, you did something wrong, and I've said, okay, here's the punishment for that. If you feel like that's out of line or it's too much or you want to discuss it, you can always come and talk to me about that, and we'll have a conversation about it as long as you do it respectfully. But the moment you start to do it disrespectfully, you have lost the right now to make an appeal. And if you kind of grow up with that idea, I mean, it's not a guarantee that you always do that, but when kids do, you know what? But they figure it out pretty fast. They figure it out pretty fast. So, if you just kind of understand there's some things that they can learn in the beginning, I think it kind of helps them understand where everything is. Now, let's bring this back to what we were just talking about. If we honor our parents, it doesn't just mean that we think about them and talk to them and treat them in an honorable way, a very respectful way. And that was the point I was making right there. You can say whatever you want to say to me as long as you say it respectfully. As long as we say it in a conversation. Tell me, make your argument, present your logic, tell me what you're thinking. I can hear any of that. But when it moves now to being disrespectful, or you're going to scream at me, now we don't get to do that. So that has to show up in the treatment. But that also means that when our parents get older, and that means that we have to kind of take that into consideration and try to be a comfort and a help to them when they get older. Okay. Jesus recalls this commandment in Matthew 15. Let me show it to you. Remember, it was one of the 10 commandments. Now Jesus is going to quote it in his earthly ministry. Matthew 15:3. And he answered and said to them, why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. Now I do want to talk about this verse just for a moment. To honor is to speak kindly and to think well of someone and to treat them accordingly. What is it to curse someone? What does he mean? Is he just talking about foul language? No, it includes that, but it's more than just that. When he says, whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. It's not just to swear at them, although I think that could certainly be part of it. But it says but I think it also includes to speak ill of them. To honor them is here, and then he says to curse them, it would be the opposite. So if it's honoring over here it's dishonoring. If it's showing respect here it's disrespect. Here it's saying good things, now here they're saying bad things. So you kind of have to get in that mode to be able to say, because look, and if you find that's in your heart, then you know you have work to do there. So we don't do evil to our parents because this is a command. And there's a reason behind this, that God is accomplishing something in this. So what is Jesus referring to when he says, whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death? That is a Hebrew phrase that essentially means, let him surely die. And the Jewish law punished cursing parents with the death penalty. Now, that's pretty severe. But that's how they thought about it. Now, now in this thing in Matthew 15, they tried to get around that. Here's what was happening. Some parents were getting older, and they needed someone to help provide for them because they couldn't work anymore. And they needed someone to kind of provide for them and to take care of them in their old age. Maybe they were poor health-wise, not always, but of course some were. And so here were kids who had the ability to help their parents and make them more comfortable or provide some necessary things for them. But they didn't want to spend their money on that. So you know what they did? Is they went to the temple and they said to the priest, we want to dedicate a large amount of money to the temple, payable upon our death. So it's kind of like you made out a will and you made the temple the beneficiary. But then when the parents needed something, the kids would say, hey, we would get that for you, but it's Corban, C-O-R-B-A-N. That's what the scripture calls it. It's promised to God. We promised this money to God. Now, we're going to get to live on it while we're alive, but when we're gone, all of that goes to God. So we promise it to God, and we can't help you out. See, you know what basically they're doing? They're doing whatever they want to do to spend their money for their life, but they're not spending any money, to honor their parents. So as a result, because they made this deal, and here's Jesus, the Son of God, and he's not going, well, that's a really good thing. You promised that. He knew what was in their heart about that, and he knew they were trying to find the loophole to get around it. And he said, you're violating the commandment by your tradition. And that's exactly what they had done. Okay, and by the way, the death penalty, pretty stiff penalty. They're trying to find a way around. If you have bad parents, Okay, so you don't become a scoundrel, but you wouldn't be honoring them by becoming a scoundrel. But you would be honoring them by doing the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Treating them with respect, not being dishonoring in the way that you're treating them. Okay, and that's actually a couple of paragraphs down, but let me talk about it here because it's great. So Clifford is saying, what do you do about parents that are not worthy of respect? They're just scoundrels, and they want you to be scoundrels, and all of that kind of business. The greatest tool that you have to be able to either, in our day, win them to Christ, or if they're Christians and they're just really bad Christians and bad people, the best tool that you have to get them to change their mind is to overcome their evil with godliness. That is the greatest tool that you have to change them. Because to despise them will not change them. And to go along with them won't change them. The greatest power to have a change for them to either be saved or to begin to live for God and to change the way they do that is to love them unconditionally in a godly fashion. And that's why you do that. Not because they deserve it, but because that is the best way to minister to them. That's a great question. So let's look at this verse 3 because here's the promise that goes along with that. And by the way, when we get to that in the notes, I want to rehearse that because I know there's something over there I said I didn't just say. So here we are. So honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth. All my life I've heard preachers preach on this verse, and they're saying, so here's the deal. If you'll honor your father and mother, then God will make sure you have a long life. That's the commandment with promise. But that's not practically true. Has there ever been anybody that honored their father and mother and died young? Died before their parents? Yeah. And so I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. And by the way, this is showing up in Ephesians. So, yeah, it is an Old Testament command. Yeah, Jesus did refer to it in his ministry. But in the dispensation of grace, Paul brings it up. And he says he said, this is the first commandment with promise. By the way, if you say, oh, it's the first commandment with promise, it's the only commandment with promise. So I don't think when he's saying it's the first commandment with promise, I don't think he's actually saying, what we think he's saying about that. Let me explain what I think this is really about, and about that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. I don't think it's saying that God is going to supernaturally protect you so that you live a long and prosperous life on the earth. Where did I get that word prosperous? That it may be well with thee. So however you want to define that, I just use that word prosperous. That may be in a lot of different ways. It may be financially, it may be, in how you live your life, whatever that is. But I think there's two things wrong with that understanding. The first one I've already mentioned. Not everybody that honored their parents lived to a ripe old age. Secondly, in the dispensation of grace, God is not intervening to lengthen the lifespan of anybody, nor is he intervening to give you a greater quality of life because you honored your father and mother. I think the verse has been largely misinterpreted. So what does Paul mean when he talks about the promise? Well, again, I think there's two things for us to look at. Number one, this is not a promise as in a statement of fact. When he says that, like if you honor your parents, it will be well with you, whatever you think that means. You're going to have a good life, you'll have a good income, you'll be happy, people will like you, however you want to define that. Look, this is not a promise that if you honor your parents, it will be well with you and you will live a long life. I want you to notice a couple of words here. That verse 3, what's that third word in the verse? May. He didn't say that it will be well with thee and thou will live a long life on the earth. He said that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. What's the difference between will and may? All right? You may or you may not. That's right. One of them is absolute. Now, so I want us to look at this here. That's going to bring us to the second issue. And that this promise is not a result of God's supernatural intervention, but it is the obvious result of the protective nature of a child obeying his parents and the result of that. Now, just as I said that to you, I knew exactly what I was talking about, but that seemed like it didn't go out there the way I wanted to. So let me illustrate it. This is what I'm talking about. You got little kids, and you're coming out of the... Billy and I went into Odessa to eat one time, and we're going to eat at Olive Garden. It's over there right around from the Walmart. Everybody knows where that is, okay. Right on 42nd Street, which is a busy street. The only parking place was a parking place that was right there, pulled right up facing the street. So we backed in, and beside us is a pickup truck, and 3 little bitty kids are coming through the parking lot. And I think it's a family. They're getting ready to get in this pickup truck and, drive off. And so I get out, I go around, I get Billy out, and then I notice these 3 little kids are just playing at the back of the truck. Now the biggest one is maybe 5 or 6 maybe, and she has climbed up onto the bumper and gotten over the tailgate, and she's in the truck. There's another one that's on the bumper holding onto the tailgate, but she's too little to get over in the tailgate. And then there's a third one, little bitty, that's standing there at the back of the truck just holding on to that ball hitch because she can't even get up on the bumper. And I'm looking around and I don't see any adults. And so we go over and I go, "Hey, where's your mommy?" And they point at the little girl in the back of the truck points at the restaurant. And I go, "You want to go see her?" "No, okay." So you know what? I picked this little girl up out of the back of the truck, and Billy grabs the little girl on the bumper and puts her down. And what do you think she does? She takes her hand, and she takes the hand of the little girl. I mean, we're right there by 42nd Street, and this traffic is just whizzing by. They're right there at the back of the truck. And so we start walking them into the restaurant, and she hasn't said a word. I don't know I think she understands me, but she probably speaks Spanish, but I think she understands me. And so anyway, we finally discover her parents and, deliver the kids. All right, that's another story because I have thoughts about that. But anyway, here's what we did. We took them by the hands. Why? Because you wouldn't want them to run out and step out into that street. So, walk with me. Have you ever done that with your kids? Take my hand. You're coming out of Walmart, you're fixing to go across to go to the parking lot, and what do you say? Come over here, take my hand. If you obey, you may live longer. I mean, that just looks pretty obvious to me, doesn't it? What is the job of a parent? To protect their kids when they're growing up. So the things that they're saying to you aren't the things that would put you in danger. They're the things that would deliver you from danger. What do parents say to teenagers? I got my car, I got my license, and I'm out doing whatever. And so what would the parents say? Yes, please drive safely. Drive safely. And when you hear those stories about how they're cutting donuts in the, on the empty street, or how they're doing, you know what? It makes your heart. But you know what? If they will do what you say, it may be well with them and they may live long on the earth. Because this is not tied to a supernatural, you honored your mother and father, nothing can happen to you now. This is the natural result of this. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you're willing as a kid to obey your parents, it may actually save your life. So when you learn, and again, I'm not saying these are the only things that kids learn, but as they get older, you want to add other things to this. And you know what you're going to be doing? You're going to be insulating. So you know what? When my buddies were about to go do stupid stuff, I opted out. Now, I didn't have a lot of buddies that got into really bad stuff, but they did do some stupid stuff. I opted out. Now, I can remember they're going, "Hey, you know what? We can go in here in the store and we can lift this stuff." And they thought it was real exciting. They'll steal some stuff. I'm just opting out. Yeah, well, okay. So, did my own stupid stuff. That's true. That's true. Thank you for bringing that up. But here's the thing. You know what? Why on the things I did opt out, why would I do that? Well, because I had been taught some things. And so that's what I think the verse is talking about. Okay. And so I've got some other illustrations in the notes. You can take a look at those. Here's another one. When a parent says, don't allow yourself to indulge in addictive behaviors because they will destroy your life. But a young man who's out living on his own decides, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get drunk and then I'm going to get behind the wheel of my car and I'm going to drive. Now, I used to work for the ambulance service when I was going to college up in Virginia. And I can remember every weekend we would be picking up those people who had had tremendously bad accidents because they couldn't control the vehicle and they were driving way too fast. If he does that, look, if he had honored his parents by saying, look, they're warning me about these kinds of behaviors. Did I ever see any of those guys killed in those accidents? Indeed, I did. If he had done what I know his parents would have told him to do, is it possible that it may have been well with him and he would have lived a longer? Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it means that if you disobey, all of you are going to die young. But I put some stats together, and just to drive this point home, I wanted to do this. So here it is. In 2023, do you know, in this country, do you know how many alcohol-related deaths there were? In other words, that alcohol played the role in their death. In 2023, you want to take a guess at how many deaths in this country? Because I put it in your notes, so if you're just reading it, don't worry, I'm going to just say it. 95,000. 95,000. Now, I got a couple of others here, because it's not just that one. But do you understand that 95,000, here's what that averages. 260 every 24 hours. Or, since I started preaching this message, 11. If you just kind of paid attention, you could have lived longer. How about drug overdoses in 2023? 105,007. And I thought it was interesting, a third of those were female, 2/3 of those, of course, were male. Man, that's even more than the others. Look, parents not only give us life, but they can help preserve our life as well. It's the job of parents to provide for their children and protect their children in the physical realm, yes. But in the spiritual realm, it is our job to protect them as well from the effects of sin and of course, to be able to know the Lord. All right, now that finishes up verse 3. That's all I wanted to say about those first 3 verses. Could we talk more about that? We could spend 6 weeks on this stuff. But I think you get the idea. Now let's do the parents end of this in verse 4. Here it is. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Why is this addressed particularly to fathers? Because it's been parents and father and mother up to this point. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, because the father is just in God's eyes, he's the recognized head of the home. And so he's saying this to the fathers, which I think now is just automatically inclusive of the mothers. In other words, I don't think the mother can say, I get to provoke my children to wrath because he didn't tell me not to. See, I think that's kind of included with that, okay? But I think there's a couple of other things that are going on here. But Paul is teaching, I think what Paul is saying when he says, don't provoke your children to wrath, I think he's talking about the instructions that you give them. I mentioned it this way earlier. It's the rules of the home. Don't make those so suffocating that it becomes extremely difficult for a kid to do that. Because if you do, now you'll be provoking them to wrath. And now you'll be encouraging them to be rebellious and disobedient. We're going to run a reference on that in just a minute. So Paul is saying, look, make the requirements, make them reasonable and proper so that you could explain your reasoning behind that. Now, I do think there's something else here, and that is because when he mentions father, is because in the home, I think what you have is, just remember, the marriage was a picture of Christ and the church. And I think the father, not that the mother can't, there's lots of single moms that are doing, incredible work, but the father is supposed to be a picture of God the Father. And when he says fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Why? Because you're supposed to now be looking at the relationship between God the Father and us as his children. So there's a spiritual parallel to that as well. But again, I just want to say, I don't think it excludes the mothers at all. A good parent-child relationship, I think, makes it easier for kids to have a relationship with God, and that's important. If children are required to obey, it's reasonable to think that their efforts to obey should not result in constant discouragement. And I'm picking that word out in just a moment. We're going to see a cross-reference about that. So it is the duty of children to obey a parent, but it's the duty of a parent to have the kind of character that requires obedience to commands which I think are reasonable and fair and proper and beneficial. So how can parents provoke their children to wrath? Well, that can be done by the way you speak to them. It can be done by unreasonable commands. It can be done by inappropriate language. It can be by being dismissive to them or being reproachful toward them or just being angry all the time. Look, can I just say something about that? If you've ever seen someone that their correction is always at 120 decibels, I mean, it never starts with just talking because they've kind of come to the place where I can't just talk to them because they won't hear it. I have to scream at them now. But you know what? If everything you do is a scream, the kids hear that like it's just talking. It just never changes. And so, anyway, I'm just saying that these inappropriate expressions of anger provoke anger in the children. Another way to provoke children to anger, if you have more than one child, is prefer that one over this one. Because kids pick up on that really easily as well. So if you treat them differently and unfairly, you'll be provoking one of them to anger. Also by denying them the necessities of life. Now, not many parents do this, but this has been done, and it provokes children to anger. I think by excessive and cruel treatment, children are provoked to anger, and by inappropriate physical punishments, children are provoked to anger. Yes, parents are God-given authorities in the home, yes, but they are accountable to God for their conduct as parents. And parents ought to correct their children when that's needed, but we shouldn't do it in a way that provokes them to wrath. And so I put this up on the board earlier because I knew I was going to be talking about these things, so I'm going to say this. To really help kids come up right, I think there are 3 great gifts that parents can give their children that do more than just about everything else combined. And here's the first one. The first great gift that parents can give their children is for the parents to have an intimate relationship with God. To have an intimate relationship with God themselves. A commitment to God's Word, that the kids can see that the place that God has in your life. I mean, I want to go back to this circle for a moment. You know what? When you ask me who I am, if you say, what is it about you that is most important? All of that is God-centered right here. You know what? I am a son of my Heavenly Father. And that is a big thing in my life, and that sits right at the center of my worldview. And so I'm using that as an illustration to say that, you know what? That is a gift beyond compare when we have a relationship with God and our kids can see it. Here's the second gift that you can give them. For parents to have a great marriage. This one is bigger than you think. For kids to be in a household where the dad is just crazy about his wife and the wife just loves her husband to death, and the way they talk to each other and treat each other and the way they do things together, it's so evident. And the kids see that, and although they may go, oh, you guys, please, all that hugging and God. All right, but you know what? That gives kids more security than just about anything. They can't explain how that happens, but it does happen. And so the gift of a great marriage and the way they treat each other, look, it's going to be very, very, if kids see your intimate relationship with God and then they see your great marriage, it's going to be really hard to provoke those kids to wrath. Because you've given them two of the three gifts that I think are super important. And the third one is for the parents to have unconditional love for their kids. Unconditional love for their kids. When children see the Lord at work in the lives of their parents, when they have the security that comes from knowing that their parents really love each other and are committed to each other, and when children can live out of the love of their parents for them, I'm going to tell you what, it's going to be really hard to provoke those kids to wrath. And I think those are the three great gifts that kids can get from their parents. And then as parents, of course, deal with godly wisdom toward their children, laboring with God and their family, right along with children who are laboring by obeying their father and mother. See, all of that works in their favor. But when the commands of a parent are unreasonable or unfair or too severe, children become discouraged. And I'm pulling that now of Colossians 3. Look at verse 21. Fathers, provoke not your... Remember, Ephesians and Colossians are kind of like spousal epistles. They sometimes are talking about the very same things in the very same order. But in Ephesians, what did he say? Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. But what does it say in Colossians? Provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. So he didn't say anything about provoking them. Well, I mean, he did say, don't provoke them to anger. But now he's giving you the reason in that, lest they get discouraged. So when a parent is evidently excited about punishing their children by doing it out of, anger, that just works to make the children angry. If a child, look, you want to get past, kids do what you say because you're bigger than them and stronger than them. You want them to understand that the things that you're saying are right. And that it ought to be obeyed. And that means that a father has to, and by the way, that was the other thing I didn't mention a while ago, but when it says, fathers, and it didn't say mothers, but I think it's implied in that, because here's the natural tendency. Look, a mom has this life that grows up in her. It's a part of her. She's aware of it every day. And then when that baby comes into the world, the way a mom cares about her children, it's different. It's different than it is for a dad. Dad doesn't grow up with that life in him. You know what? It's outside of him. Do fathers love their children? I think they do. But here's the way it normally works. The father is the one that is more prone to be too severe, and the mother is more prone to being too lenient. That's just kind of the general direction that those go. And so if you don't realize that, and if husbands and wives don't talk about this so that they're on the same page when it comes to the kids, that will become now a divider in their marriage as well. So you have to you have to understand that and deal with it, I think, up front. So a father doesn't punish his kids because he's angry, but because they have violated that which is right, so that they can learn to do what is right. And a good rule, and give you one more thing too, that when you're talking about children, and I've mentioned this lots of times, so I'll just say it and move on, that 10-to-1 ratio of praise to correction or criticism, if for every time you have to correct them or be critical of something, you have 10 times genuinely praised them, that makes a difference as well. Because then what you get, but if the only time they hear is when they mess up, then you know what a kid gets thinking? I can't get it right. I can't make my dad happy. My parents are always upset with me. I'm never going to be able to please them. So show them the things that you are pleased with and praise them for those legitimate things. And I think, you know what? Now you've taken a big step toward when correction comes, it will be more helpful than it will be discouraging. And I think that's the way it ought to be for all the parents. Okay, now let me address the children just for a moment. What do you do when you have been provoked to anger? What about when the unreasonableness of your parents has upset you? What does God expect of you? So here you are in the home. You know, let's say you're 15 years old, you're in the home, and now you've been treated unreasonably or you've been treated unfairly. It's happened over and over. Now you're really discouraged about that. If you know the Lord, what does God expect from you? Listen carefully. When Paul was being persecuted, he had that messenger of Satan that he said was a thorn in his flesh, and he prayed for God to remove it. What did God say to Paul?
My grace is sufficient.
There you go. My grace is sufficient. When Paul was being persecuted, what was the answer? My grace is sufficient. When Paul was doing without the necessities of life, and I'm not just talking about shelter, but I'm talking about clothing and I'm talking about food. The same answer that was good enough for the Apostle Paul is good enough for parents and it's good enough for kids. God's grace is sufficient for you. I've got this unreasonable parent and they won't let me go do this, and there's no good reason they shouldn't let me go do that. That is not the issue. The issue for you is how to appropriate the grace of God to deal with unreasonableness and unfairness in this world. Does anybody think living in this world is fair? Are you kidding? So what is the answer to that? The answer is the grace of God. It is sufficient. And so I'll turn this back around to Clifford's deal. What about if your parents are just terrible, terrible parents? Then that is when you appropriate the grace of God to do the godly thing, not because they deserve it, but because your Heavenly Father has asked you to do that, living out of grace. So, unless your parents ask you to commit sin, unless they ask you to commit moral wrong, unless they're asking you to do something that would be illegal to do, then what? Well, then we obey our parents. And that's a difficult thing sometimes. But here's what God knows. There will always be those exceptions, and if we tear apart the family unit over that, there'll be no family unit. And that's why this is a godly labor, because God means to preserve that divine institution. And our Heavenly Father is counting on us to do our part, whether we're the parent or whether we're the child. So don't make the mistake of being motivated by external means, from things on the outside. Be motivated from your inner man. Can I just say, parents do this. We don't mean to do it, but we do this. When we bring that little baby home from the hospital, and for the next months, you know what we do? We treasure that baby. We coddle that baby. We take care of it. We change its diapers. We talk to it in that funny voice we don't talk to anybody else with. We smile at them. We do everything to try to make them happy. And then one day, that kid is old enough when we hear him, you know, when mommy says, I love you. And then one day that kid goes, I love you, mommy. Oh, be careful right there. That is so great. Yeah, that is so great. But be careful that you don't move your motivation from what was in you to now you're being motivated external to you by them. Because one day, I can remember I was in elementary school. My dad was taking me to work. Yeah, right. I had to work in the mines early on. He's dropping me off at school. We were just an affectionate family. So if mom or dad was dropping me off, I always kissed them and then got out of the car. And here's my dad, and I knew what the ritual was. But for some reason on this day, it felt uncomfortable. Like, I'm too big for that. And I don't want to be sitting here in front of everybody. You know, I'm just going to get out of the car. I never asked my dad if that, because you know what? A lot of parents would be like, hey, where's my kiss? What's going on here? You know, and then you don't want to hurt their feelings, but at the same time, you're going like, I think I'm too old for that now. You know, and that it's just part of growing up. You know, I mean, it's just the stuff that you do. If you allow your motivation to be in what they do instead of what's in you, now you have given away that ability to continue to be toward them the way that you were. So yeah, it's great when they start returning that affection, but then when the day comes they don't return that, now you're depressed, I'm discouraged, I'm unhappy. Don't give that away. Let that stay within you. Now, if that makes any sense, and that probably deserves more than that, but that's all I'm going to say about that. So don't make the mistake of being motivated by external things. Make a sonship decision to obey the doctrine of Ephesians 6, even when it's not convenient and when it's not comfortable. And take comfort in the work that's being done in your inner man to conform you to the image of God's Son. Here's the last verse, and I have just a couple things to say about it and we'll be done. Hebrews 5:8 makes a very important statement about the Son. And here it is. It says, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. That is quite the statement. So just as Jesus learned obedience through the things that he suffered, when we are suffering, you know what we're doing? We're learning obedience. Because if you're only obeying because you already want to do that, that's not really a test of obedience. So, what do we do about adult children who have their own families and don't think their kids or their parents are worthy of honor? Maybe they're not saved, or maybe they just weren't good parents. The command is still the same. Honor your father and mother. Because, and I mentioned this earlier, and I finally got to it here at the end again, that is the best opportunity that you will ever have to win them to Christ, or by choosing to honor them even when they are not deserving. And if by your godly actions the time comes that you are treating them the way that you do, they may one day say this. I'm going to close with this story. They may say, realizing how they have behaved toward you and how you have behaved toward them, and seeing the disparity of that, may say to you, why are you so good to me? And when they ask that question, don't wait till that moment to put your answer together. Plan it ahead of time. So I'm going to tell you the story to illustrate that. So, of course, everybody knows I live out in West Texas. And where I live, everything is back roads. So I'm traveling on one of those back roads, and I stopped at a gas station to get a bag of ice. And when I entered the store, there was a lady attendant. She was the only one in the store. And I walk in, and I don't realize she's on the phone at first. And I said, "Do you have ice?" And she kind of put her hand up just for a second. And then I realized she was on her phone. So I'm just kind of looking around the store, seeing if I can locate, is there an ice machine in here? And then I'm not trying to eavesdrop, but I can hear her talking, and she's on the phone, and she's crying. And she's trying to explain why she's so exasperated. And when she hung up, I stepped back over, and I just said, "Hey, I'm sorry, do you have ice?" And of course, she's wiping her eyes like this, and she says, I'm sorry. She says, I know you probably saw. And what she was upset about is, now here's what you have to understand. She's sitting in a wheelchair, and she has a walker. But she has dropped some bottles. She's loading bottles in the cooler. She's dropped them. They've broken on the floor. And so all of the contents is out over the floor and the glass on the floor. And I realize she can't really get down there and clean that up. And so when she's telling me, I'm sorry, I dropped those things. And I hope you didn't step on that glass. And, and she's doing all of that. And I'm going, and I'm just looking, at her. And I'm thinking, let me just help her out. So I said, "Hey, do you have a broom and a mop?" And she goes, no, don't, no. And they had ice, by the way. So I knew you were all waiting to hear the end of that. So anyway, I said, "Look, let me just help you out here." So I go back in the back, and I fill up the mop bucket, and I bring it out, and I get the containers part swept up, and now I've got all the liquid on the floor, and I'm mopping it up, and I got a little pine saw in there, and I dump that outside in the parking lot and bring it back in. And here's what she says to me. She goes, "Why would you help me?" Now, if I had waited till that moment, I would have just said, "Oh, it's no big deal." That may be true, but here was an opportunity to open a door, and I said, because I have learned that this is the way the Bible tells me to live my life. And that was the opportunity for me to witness to her. And it turns out that she knew the Lord. But I didn't know that. So I'm just saying, but if you plan that answer ahead of time, you might just go, "Oh, don't worry about it, it's no big deal," or, "I know exactly how you feel, I've been there before." But see, that loses the opportunity now to make an impact, a spiritual impact in her life, to move the whole conversation that way. You know what that becomes then? That becomes godly living. When I'm doing it for that purpose, that becomes godly living. I'm not laboring with God in that. That wasn't something He told me specifically about in His Word. But it does put some other principles of godly love into practice, and that becomes godly living. And I just want to have all of that kind of stuff working in my life. So what I'm saying to you here is, if you're good to a bad parent, there may come a day when they go, "Why are you good to me?" Now you have an opportunity to maybe give them the gospel, or to talk to them about the difference that the life of Christ can make in the way that they live their life. So I just say that is I see that as the best opportunity to be able to change their actual condition. I've already gone over, so I'll pick up this last phrase when we come back the next time. I mean, at the end of that in Ephesians 6:4, Paul says, "But bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord." I did want to complete that, and there's not a lot to say about it, but I'll complete that next time, and then we'll move on to the next form of doctrine. So let's have a word of prayer, and we'll be done. Heavenly Father, as we look at this entire section in Ephesians, I pray that we'll understand that these are all areas of godly labor on our part. This is also advanced labor. It's in Ephesians, not just Romans, which is meant to take place on top of that Romans foundational doctrine. And that means that we've got to be committed to putting it into practice in our own lives when the opportunity presents itself. So thank you for your word and its power to conform us to the image of your Son. Equip us, Lord, for this in our own lives, or at least to be able to help others. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.